Um, Hello and welcome to Natural Law and Reformed Theology, co-hosted by the James Wilson Institute and First Liberty Institute. My name is Garrett Snedeker, and I'm the Deputy Director of the James Wilson Institute. Before we shift over to our main event and I turn to our founder and director, Hadley Arkes, I wanted to offer some words of thanks to First Liberty for co-hosting this event with us. Particularly, I'd like to thank Trey Dimsdale, First Liberty's Director of Strategic Partnerships, who's been an excellent collaborator every step of the way in planning this program. We're pleased to count First Liberty as one of our fellowship patrons for this upcoming summer's James Wilson Fellowship for Young Lawyers. And anyone in the audience interested in joining First Liberty and other generous sponsors in sponsoring one of our 15 fellows this summer is invited to contact us after the event. Last, although you should have received fuller biographies for our roundtablers for everyone's benefit, here are some extremely short introductions, and it's only in the interest of time that we don't present their biographies in full. So first, our two main presenters. Justin Dyer is a professor of political science at the University of Missouri and director of the school's Kinder Institute. Justin's also one of our affiliated scholars at the James Wilson Institute. Next, Jordan Ballor is a research fellow at First Liberty Institute and director of publishing at the Acton Institute. Offering commentary later in the program is Frank Beckwith. Frank is professor of philosophy and church-state studies at Ballor University. He's also one of our affiliated scholars at the James Wilson Institute. Paul DeHart is associate professor of political science at Texas State University and also one of our affiliated scholars at the James Wilson Institute. And finally, to moderate today's discussion will be Hadley Arkes, founder and director of the James Wilson Institute. Hadley, take it away.
Okay, well, first, welcome everyone. Thanks for carving out the time and sitting in with us. This project, this subject is just fitted for this project by James Wilson Institute. And I'm pleased to note these three figures here have been active members in the project. Justin Dyer, Paul DeHart, and Frank Beckwith, and we're just happy to welcome Jordan to this thing, and just glad to have him with us. This struck me that we were on the edge of Passover and Easter. In that case, I can't quite resist drawing on that scene in Tom Stoppard's The Invention of Love, when the young A.E. Houseman is doing a kind of a riff for his sister on God's words to Moses as he's showing him the promised land, which he will not enter. And he says, I am giving you all of Gilead unto Dan. I'm giving you all of Naphtali, all of the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all of Judah unto the utmost sea, but not including Wales, which I'm saving for the Methodists. Now, I take it that the point of entry here is the old enduring question, whether we can have access to reason alone to the moral truths that must govern our lives, quite apart from God and revelation. A while back, Carl Henry recorded the objections of Protestant orthodoxy that we don't derive essential content of ethics from philosophical reasoning, but from rational revelation. So he warned that Thomas Aquinas may have thought that he was directing Aristotelian thought Godward. Instead, he grounded Christian theism and morality on secular turf, an argument that Spinoza anticipated a long while back. And yet we could find strong strands of Protestantism reaching out to connections with natural law. We find Calvin affirming that a natural order of laws can be discerned by men and women. Those laws do in fact exist. He conceded a certain moral light that even unredeemed humanity possessed, by which they would have the power to distinguish between what is just and unjust, what is good and evil. And Bob Riley, who I think is sitting in with us today, Bob in his recent book has done a fine chapter on Richard Hooker, making the strong case for reason woven into theology. But Henry's line, as I said, was anticipated by Spinoza as he marked the distinct spheres of philosophy and revelation. And he warned of those people trying to prove the teachings of Scripture, for a project of that kind, he said, would bring theology under reason's dominion. And yet Spinoza told us that philosophy is the light of the mind, and it takes just a timid trust in Scripture if you insist that faith can't be upheld unless people keep themselves in ignorance. But there's, of course, this goes to do with him as a writing between the lines. The secret that isn't quite speaking its name is that philosophy is dominant after all, that we have to consider the grounds on which we adjudicate to these claims we're back again to reason after all. So it may be just a matter of leading us back to John Paul II's argument in Fides et Ratio, that there've always been two wings, philosophy and faith, that philosophy has always gone hand in hand with serious theology, and philosophy may be able to explain its own limits, or the things we cannot explain through philosophy or claim to know apart from faith. But we have here four people who've reflected on this matter with a study that's run well beyond my own. And so I'm going to turn the matter over happily to Jordan and Justin. Each will speak for about 10 to 20 minutes. Then we'll bring Frank and Paul in for their own angles on the problem. And then we'll fall into the mode of a conversation, and then invite friends who are listening in to join that conversation. So with that, Jordan, let me turn it over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Hadley, and thanks for this honor of being able to participate in this discussion. It's a topic that has been of great interest to me in my own research and my own constructive thinking about the role of the church in the modern world, and so I'm happy to be here. I guess the best point of departure from my perspective is to approach it historically. And Hadley, I appreciate that you brought up Carl Henry and Spinoza, and I'm going to get back to them, but it's going to take me a few minutes to do that. So I want to start the story all the way back at the beginning of the Reformation. We're talking about the relationship between natural law and Reformed theology. And I want to start with this characterization that came to us in the middle of the 20th century. So John McNeill, who's known as the editor of the most recent edition of Calvin's Institute, the McNeill Battles translation, wrote this in 1946. He said, "There is no real discontinuity between the teaching of the Reformers and that of their predecessors with respect to natural law." So his predecessors there, of course, he's talking about the medievals. And this was McNeill's summary, actually his opening statement in an important article published in 1946 on the teaching of the Reformers with respect to natural law. Now, there's a lot that happens in the 20th century that we're going to get to. But first, I want to kind of take this as a historical point of departure, that the early Reformers in the 16th century, as well as the later generations of the Reformers, as we move into Reformed Orthodoxy and Protestant scholastics in the 16th and 17th centuries, all affirm natural law in the main. And so there's no real discontinuity, as McNeill says. This is true for the figures that are well known. Hadley already mentioned Calvin. You could say this is true for Luther, as well as for those who are not as perhaps well known popularly, but are well known within the scholarship and certainly within the specialized fields of early modern studies. Figures like Philip Melanchthon, Ulrich Zwingli, Martin Butzer, Heinrich Bullinger, Peter Martyr Vermigli, Jerome Zanchi, Wolfgang Musculus, Niels Hemmingsen. These are all important theologians from the broad Protestant and mostly Reformed tradition who affirmed versions of natural law explicitly in their writings in the 16th century. It's also true for later Protestant Orthodox theologians who are writing after the establishment of Protestant confessional orthodoxy and writing from within identifiable now schools and traditions of Protestant thought. So students of John Calvin, like Franciscus Junius, other Reformed figures like Francis Turretin, Richard Baxter is an important figure in this regard. He represents an important link between medieval and Roman Catholic scholastic traditions and Protestant scholasticism. Another figure who comes up in the writings of Jonathan Edwards, that great American theologian, Petrus von Maastricht, a representative of Reformed Orthodoxy. All these figures, in admittedly diverse ways, affirmed versions of natural law thinking and natural law. So that's all to sort of underline and reinforce and reiterate the opening statement from McNeill from 1946. There's a sense, though, that the question is also about not just what individual theologians taught, but what does the tradition itself teach? And on this level, it's important to understand what the Reformed confessions themselves say about the natural law, but also, as Hadley indicated, the correlative question of the relationship between faith and reason. Despite its controversial nature, its somewhat bad publicity, you can actually find an affirmation of something like natural law in the Canons of Dort, that most famous Reformed confessional symbol of the early 17th century. The Canons of Dort affirm that there's an image of God remaining in fallen humanity, which includes the sparks of the light of nature. Let me just read a little bit from the Canons of Dort. It says, "There remain, however, in man since the fall, the glimmerings of natural light, whereby he retains some knowledge of God, of natural things, and of the difference between good and evil, and shows some regard for virtue and good outward behavior." That's from the Canons of Dort. Another important confessional symbol of the Reformed faith is the Heidelberg Catechism, first written in 1563. And importantly for the Heidelberg Catechism, the moral law, as summarized in the Decalogue, which is in the Reformed tradition broadly understood to reiterate the moral order, the natural law, is used in a positive way in the third section. So the formation of the Heidelberg Catechism thematically moves from the establishment of guilt to the reality of grace represented in the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, and the life of the Christian believer characterized by gratitude. And the rule, the norm for gratitude in the Christian life that's given is that moral law in the Heidelberg Catechism. Just one other confessional reference I want to make, and it goes back to the question of a relationship between philosophy and theology, as Spinoza posed it, for example. So keep that claim from Spinoza in your mind as you're listening to this from the Belgic Confession, another important standard of the Reformed faith from the continent in the 16th century. In Article 2, right at the beginning of this confession, the Belgic talks about how we come to know God. And it says, "We know him by two means. First, by the creation, preservation, and government of the universe, which is before our eyes as a most elegant book, wherein all creatures, great and small, are as so many characters, leading us to clearly see the invisible things of God, even his everlasting power and divinity, as the Apostle Paul says." And the reference there is to Romans 1:20. "All things of which are sufficient to convince men and leave them without excuse." So there's an important dynamic there that's a particular Reformed accent of the use of natural law that we see articulated in the Belgic Confession. So here the Belgic talks about special revelation in relationship to the revelation that we have in creation, and talks about them as two different books, both of which are ways of learning about God. And in fact, special revelation can function as a kind of corrective spectacles to help clarify those letters that are written to us in creation by God through his general and natural revelation. The Westminster Standards in the Presbyterian tradition have a very similar dynamic. So in summary, let me claim that arising out of the 16th and 17th century, the Reformed tradition, both in terms of these major theological figures and articulators, as well as at the confessional level, affirm the reality of natural law, especially understood in terms of its ontology, the reality of natural law, a natural moral order that is coextensive and with creation. They do affirm some important qualifications with respect to the epistemology and the practical implications of natural law, but there's still a positive understanding of the way that natural law can function in the world. The Reformed, in this sense, I think, are unanimous that natural law exists and is known or knowable enough to leave human beings without excuse. It does also have some positive consequences, however, so it's not just condemning in this sense. Natural law manifests itself in some ways among the unregenerate, among non-Christians, among unbelievers, including in the natural law institutions of the family and government. So you can see affirmations that there is some recognition of these natural law institutions among the pagan. These things exist and function there. The natural law also functions positively as a guide for Christian life, as I've already mentioned. And these are the so-called three uses of the law, formulated first by Philip Melanchthon, but present in the teaching of Luther, and obviously taken up by Calvin and the Reformed tradition, importantly. The first part of McNeill's, one part of McNeill's important claim has to do with the predecessors, however, right, of the Reformed. So what's the relationship between these reformers in the 16th century and the scholastic traditions that are coming out of the Middle Ages? There is, as McNeill says, continuity between the medieval period and the diversity of philosophical and theological interactions, both with respect to metaphysics, but with respect to natural law in particular, and the Reformed traditions that come after. So there's continuity, but it's continuity of diversity. Natural law isn't just one thing. There isn't one single way of asserting or grounding or articulating the natural law, even in the medieval period. And that diversity of thought is carried up in its fullness, in some sense, into the early generations of the Reformation. So these differences between different schools of thought and different theories and conflicts came over into the 16th century. They tended not, at least early on, to be identified along confessional lines. So at least among the Protestants. So you can find Reformed figures who are more sympathetic, say with Thomas and his typology of law, and others who are more scotistic. There's a kind of an eclecticism here philosophically with respect to receiving the medieval traditions and the medieval scholastic traditions. So you've got this interesting constellation and cross-fertilization and conflict between the Reformed and the Remonstrants and Arminians on the one hand on the Protestant side, and between Dominicans and Jesuits, for example, in the 16th and 17th centuries with respect to questions of anthropology and soteriology and natural law. Just in a couple concluding minutes, with respect to the two figures that I picked up on from Hadley's opening questions, those Carl Henry and Spinoza, I think it's important. Yeah, Carl Henry is a great place to start for this question because of his influence in 20th century evangelicalism. And I do think that his position represents something like the majority view of evangelicals or Protestants in the 20th century, at least in America. But I do think you have to say that those are at odds with the Reformed tradition itself, at least as I've briefly outlined it here in the 16th and 17th century. So, you know, it might be too blunt to say that in substance, the Reformed of the 16th, 17th centuries are closer to someone like Thomas than they are to Carl Henry. But I think that's true, at least in terms of the substance of their affirmation of natural law. Let me just give you one little additional data point. In terms of a corrective, say, to Henry's claims, he didn't have to wait too long. His son, Paul Henry, wrote an important, but I think not very well known dissertation when he was doing his doctoral work in political science at Duke. And his dissertation was written in 1970. And here's the title of the dissertation: Types of Protestant Theology and the Natural Law Tradition. And I'm just going to read a little bit from the abstract of his dissertation, because this is, again, in 1970. It opens, and this is Paul Henry, Carl's son: the literature of normative and historical political theory frequently assumes that the current general disregard for natural law concepts of social ethics can be traced in part to the effects of the Protestant Reformation. It is argued on this view that the principles of Protestantism contain elements of irrationalism, nominalism, and positivism, all of which militate against the development of a Protestant formulation of natural ethics. He does a historical study, and this is, without a spoiler alert here, this was written 50 years ago, so hopefully it's not too shocking to anybody. We conclude that, as Henry concludes, by arguing that the relationship between Protestant theology and natural law tradition has not been an entirely negative one. That's quite a academic way of qualifying the claim. He says, arguments to the contrary, that it's a purely negative relationship, are generally based on the indebtedness of Schleiermacher to the formalism of Kantian ethics and or the profound impact of the irrationalism of the early Barth. So there's an important continuing story here that picks up on some of the dynamics introduced by Spinoza with the relationship between faith and reason and the proper relationship of those two faculties or expressions of human reality that continue on into the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Justin to pick up a little bit as we transition out of the era of the second scholasticism and Protestant orthodoxy to that of the Enlightenment in the 18th century.
All right. Well, thank you, Jordan. I'm going to begin on an autobiographical note and try to wind our way back to the American founding and put on the table some of the questions that we can continue to discuss today. When I was in high school, I went to public school, had a very modest assignment in one of my English classes, and it was to go to the library, pick out any book and read it. And so I'm looking at the shelf and I see Mere Christianity, recognized C.S. Lewis's name, and so pulled it down. And for those of you who are familiar with Mere Christianity, one of the beginning chapters is called The Law of Human Nature. And so I pull it down, I start to read it, and I really didn't know much about Lewis other than his authorship of the Chronicles of Narnia at that point in my life, but found out later the backstory of that book, which was that Lewis had been invited to give a series of addresses on the BBC during World War II, and it was to explain to the British people what Christians believe. And it was this odd moment where Lewis is being asked to re-evangelize in some way, or at least just re-explain what their ostensibly Christian country is committed to in the course of World War II. And so he begins, and I think in this telling way, he begins with the law of human nature. And that book is later published as Mere Christianity, or those talks are compiled together as Mere Christianity. Lewis says that his goal in giving those talks is to put down a statement of what all Christians believe. That was his idea with Mere Christianity, the idea that there would be a cross-section of belief in which all Christians would be able to affirm. He sends this out to various clergy and different denominations, and he tries to come up with a product that he thinks everyone can sign off on. And so it's telling to me that at this moment in our history, he is putting out the natural law, the reality of the moral law, as the starting point that he thinks people have to be committed to before they can get to the revealed doctrines of Christianity that he's going to explain to them. And he makes this comment in that first talk. He says that the idea that there is a moral law and its related idea that we fail to keep it. He said those are the keys to all clear thinking about the universe and about ourselves. And so I remember thinking about that and thinking that's a pretty important claim and it's worth investigating that a bit more. I think connected that to the American founding as an undergrad student. I took a class called Foundations of American Politics. We read some of the political sermons of the founding era, read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, read the Declaration of Independence. And I remember just picking up on that thread of natural law throughout the American founding and connecting it to what I had read with Lewis. And so it developed this interest in natural law. I thought that's what political science was at the time, and nobody told me otherwise. And so I went to graduate school. And when I was at graduate school, I was doing more work on natural law. I'm thinking about natural law in the context of the American founding. And I had one of my dissertation committee members who told me, this is in the context of a dissertation project on anti-slavery constitutionalism and natural law. And what he said to me was that the God of nature is not the God of Abraham. And so as I'm focusing on natural law and talking about some of the theological claims, he says, you're too quick to associate or to assume that the God of nature is compatible with the God of Abraham. But he says there's this other tradition that sees the God of nature as something distinct, or natural law as something distinct, not a complement to, but a rival to the God of Abraham. And so that was my first, I think, hard push to think about that challenge on one side. This idea that from the perspective of philosophy, that the appeal to nature and to nature's God was in fact a move away from the biblical tradition and the Christian tradition. So that was on one side. On the other side then, I had a colleague at the University of Missouri where I teach now, a colleague who pushed me from a different direction. And he said that I should really take more seriously the claims that you get from some of the Reformed theologians like Karl Barth, that natural law is epistemically unreliable, that our reason cannot uncover these kinds of truths, that we have to appeal to the revelation of the person of Jesus Christ as it's pointed to through Scripture. And he pointed me to some of Karl Barth's writings. I read that and started thinking about this from a different angle. And I was reminded in that process of Pascal's line in his poem about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and not the God of the philosophers. And so from this different perspective, but from a religious perspective, you can also have that assumption that there's a tension here between what we might know by reason and an appeal in political life or social life to nature, and what you might get from scripture or from revelation or for the claims of religious authority. And so I think this helps us situate our problem, our modern problem of natural law and reformed theology. On the one hand, we have scholars who say that all this talk of nature is really an alternative to revelation. And so to the extent that we can go through the American founding, we see the appeal to the laws of nature and of nature's God, and we see the appeal to natural law, that's all a subtle subversion of Christianity and the Christian tradition that came before it. And so you have that on the one hand. And then on the other, you have those who are influenced by the Reformed tradition, and particularly the 20th century Reformed tradition that's indebted in some ways to Karl Barth and his claims against natural law, who would just say, yeah, that's right. They actually agree. And then they just say so much the worse for natural law. And so there is this fundamental agreement in some ways about the tension or the incompatibility between reason and revelation. And then people go in different directions with that in terms of what side you're going to end up with. On the one hand, you might think that revelation is unreasonable, and that gives you a reason to discount revelation. On the other hand, you might think reason is untrustworthy, and that gives you a reason, awkwardly to put it in that idiom, but it gives you a reason to discount reason. But I think that's not the only option on the table. And Jordan had gone through, I think, a great history of the Protestant tradition and the Reformed tradition and its reliance on natural law, even post-Reformation, that the issues that were crucial in that period didn't have to be the same issues that are at stake in the debate about natural law. And within the American founding, I think there is a dominant tradition, one that Bob Riley writes about very well in his recent book that I recommend to you. I know he's listening in, but it's a dominant tradition in the American founding that sees these two things as compatible, reason and revelation not at odds, not as antagonistic, but compatible with each other, and that also was aware of some of the deeper underlying philosophical questions that are important to answer this, and that addressed those questions. And one of the primary people that I'm thinking about here is James Wilson. This is an event by the James Wilson Institute, and James Wilson is one of the foremost thinkers in the American founding. He's not just one of the founders when it comes to jurisprudence, he is arguably the preeminent founder when it comes to jurisprudence. And James Wilson, just a little bit of background about him and what he had to say on this topic. Wilson, one of only 6 men, I think, to sign both the Declaration and the Constitution. He's appointed to the first Supreme Court. While he's on the Supreme Court, he has in mind a book project that he wants to write, his lectures on law, and he wants it to be for American jurisprudence what Blackstone's commentaries had been for the common law. And so he has a project that he is undertaking where he wants to put down the foundational principles of American jurisprudence. And this comes out in a series of lectures that he gives to students at what becomes the University of Pennsylvania. And that first lecture, it's quite intimidating if you read the edited volume that Liberty Fund puts out of that lecture, but it's quite an intimidating crowd for his first lecture. It includes the president, the president's first lady, the vice president, both houses of Congress, and both houses of the state legislature. So that's his audience for this lecture. And then it proceeds in a class that he gives something like 54 lectures, and that comes together in his lectures on law. Now, thinking about those lectures on law, they're not like the lectures on law you might get today. If you had gone to a law school or expected to see a preeminent jurist or Supreme Court justice trying to put down the fundamental principles of law. And in the first lecture that he gives on the law, when he really gets into the substance, he says this. He says, order, proportion, and fitness pervade the universe. Around us we see, within us we feel, above us we admire a rule from which a deviation cannot or should not or will not be made. And so he begins with this pervasive sense of natural order. And this order, he says, applies to even God himself. And God, he says, is the great and incomprehensible author and preserver and ruler of all things, the one who himself works not without an eternal decree. And by saying this, he's launching into a philosophical debate about God and ethics as the foundational or one of the foundational questions of jurisprudence. And Lewis is asking very early on in these lectures about the source of moral obligation. How do we understand what the source of moral obligation is? And it sounds like an academic question, obscure question, but the stakes are actually high. On the one hand, as Wilson says, if moral obligation originates in God's reason and God's reason alone, then we seem to allow some kind of a disunity in God's nature, submits God to a law that he didn't create. Where did this reason come from? On the other hand, Wilson says, if moral obligation originates simply in God's will, in what he desires or wants, then it seems like it lacks a reason. The content of ethics is arbitrary. There's no reason for it, and it's rooted simply in power as the sufficient cause of God's authority. And Wilson proposes this middle way, recognize the unity of power and goodness, and the unity of power and goodness in God's nature and in the fundamental underlying principles of law. And this is leveled partly as a critique of Blackstone, and he's trying to improve upon Blackstone. And Blackstone had said that the definition of law was a rule of action which is prescribed by some superior into which the inferior is bound to obey. And Wilson says, well, that can't be it, or that can't be the only thing that matters. It's not just superior strength, that there has to be something more. Power might be necessary, but it's not sufficient to establish and promulgate authoritative law. And Wilson said that by analogy, this would apply to human law as well. And human law would find its limits in the eternal law that emanates from the divine nature. And if you go back through Wilson and you actually recreate his typology of law that he develops here, it maps one-to-one onto Richard Hooker's typology of law and how Richard Hooker thought about law. And if you look at Hooker and map that onto Thomas Aquinas, it's a one-to-one match as well. And so at least in this way, I think in these foundational questions, you have a strong and a dominant tradition in the American founding that really is tapping into the classical natural law tradition. And that's a controversial thing to say, given the structure of the debate that I just laid out. And so it's definitely a contested kind of question, but it helps us make sense of this part of our tradition. If we relate it to a more contemporary debate, we might think of Martin Luther King Jr.'s insistence in the letter from Birmingham jail that an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal and natural law. And this is something that I think is precisely what Wilson is claiming. But Wilson's plumbing the depths of the philosophical underpinnings that would make sense of such a statement that could make it coherent. And so within Wilson's early lectures on law, just to summarize, I think what he gives us to tee up some things for discussion, he gives us a statement that reason and revelation are consistent. He says they flow from the same adorable source. He gives us a statement that moral obligation originates in the reason and the goodness of God. And he gives us an affirmation of classical natural law. And that is part of the American tradition. And the question then is, what's the takeaway? What's the point of this? Is it merely an antiquarian interest in what people thought in the 18th century? And I think the answer is no. There's all sorts of important things that come from this. First, certainly if you're a religious believer or a serious philosopher, these are important questions and questions we must address. But also if we want to think about our own moment in jurisprudence and politics, whether the American founding is a source of wisdom for us or not, whether it's worth returning to or not, I think hinges partly on how we understand and interpret these sources. And there are plenty of people today, I think, who would like to see us move away from the founding precisely because they see the founding as fatally flawed in some way by being modern and not classical. And to the extent that that's true, that's a fair point, but we have to establish whether that's true first. And I think Wilson gives us some resources to really think through these questions, to think through the relationship between Reformed theology and natural law, and to think about the place of natural law within our tradition. Hadley, you're muted.
Am I there?
Yeah.
Oh, I think Wilson, thank you both, and we'll get just a few comments. Wilson drew on Burlamaqui and the natural law to say, well, there are two understandings of law. One, that it emanates from a lawgiver, and two, that it springs from reason. But they said we have more confidence that we're getting the word from a lawgiver when it is in accord with reason. Well, Justin mentions those lectures, and they are just a rich field drawing on Latin and Greek, and on the best plane of the best philosophy, dealing with epistemology. And of course, in that opening lecture, he raised the question, if we have natural rights, when do they begin? And the answer was, as soon as we begin to be, which is why the common law casts its protection on the unborn child from the first moments in the womb. Now, boy, I'm struck by, again, I've heard the argument before that the God of the Declaration was not the God of Israel, though I think many of the founders certainly thought it was. But I wonder, these people think that the God of the founders was a positivist? Was that the sense of it? My late father-in-law had a book of commentaries in which there was a commentary on from Kings 2 on Elijah at Mount Horeb, and God tells him, go to Damascus and tell Hazael that he's out as the ruler. And the commentator says this was a sign of how early the Jews were committed to monotheism, like 9th century BCE. I thought we'd always monotheists, but as David Novak said, well, there's a kind of time when they were just henotheists. This was the local God. Well, the God who could tell the prophet to go across the lines of jurisdiction and cashier a ruler in another place was obviously not one of those local gods known to antiquity. This must have been a God with a universal jurisdiction. So it's hard to imagine that the people think people saw the author of the laws of nature, the Declaration, could possibly think that he could have been the source of a moral law that differs from Nairobi to Jersey City. It's simply an implausible project. It's just picking up one more item from Justin. There was that wonderful passage in Hamilton, that pamphlet he wrote when he was about 17 years old, and he said that the great mistake of Hobbes was that he discounted that superintending principle, that is God, would be the source of a moral law that will be there even when governments break down, and were there before governments existed. So I don't see how anyone could sort of read that passage of that kind in the pamphlet of the revolution and think that this is simply a deistic God, or a God that not take a strong interest. Just a quick word for Jordan. That was itself a rich presentation, and I recognize a couple of the writers you cited, but the list was filled out with people whose books haven't been reviewed of late in the Wall Street Journal. And I bet that others, friends, listening in on this would have the same interest I would have in seeing that bibliography and seeing those items. So I'm going to plant that for us to do at some point. But two questions I would pose, and we'll just back into the conversation. One, listening to Jordan, I wonder, given that history you cited, why do we have the problem today? Why do people think there is division? Among lawyers, we understand it all comes from Holmes, his skepticism about natural law and moral truth. But why do we still have this enduring problem? I'd be curious to find out more, probe a bit more into that problem you pose about the differences in natural law. You know, in our own time, we've had Judge Richard Posner said that infanticide and incest must be in accord with natural law because these are intractable parts of the human experience. And so they must spring from something imminent in human nature. But of course, natural law has always made a clear distinction between what is higher and lower. and the recognition of the wrong of killing the innocent. Or Kant's point that you make a serious mistake if you try to draw out a scheme of natural law by simply offering a generalization about the checkered history of our species, because there has been incest. It must be in accord with natural law. Okay, but I'm glad we have both of those presentations, both the talks recorded. So let me turn over to Frank. Make Frank and Paul into this. Frank, did you want to?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Hadley. Thank you so much, Jordan and Justin, for your wonderful presentations. I'm going to just raise a few questions and comments about actually something that Hadley raised just a few moments ago about why is it that there are these disagreements today that, as Jordan, I think, correctly pointed out, wasn't really the case during the early days of the Reformation and subsequently with the ascendancy of post-Reformation Protestant scholasticism. I want to go back to Carl Henry and something that he said in his article that appeared in 2003 in First Things. And here he's discussing what he calls the Thomistic view of natural law. He says the three contentions of the Thomist doctrine of natural law that evoke evangelical criticism are: one, that independently of divine revelation, there exists a universally shared body or system of moral beliefs that human reasoning articulates despite the noetic consequences of the Adamic fall. And I think you get in that very brief comment, I think, a number of misunderstandings of the nature of the natural law, as understood, at least in my tradition, Catholicism. The first thing that stands out is that the natural law, I think, at least the way in which Henry envisions it, or at least he thinks the way Catholics think about it, as a kind of answer to the Rawlsian challenge of public reason. That is, the Rawlsian comes along and other political liberals and saying, you can't give your religious reasons in the public square, you need public reasons. And the natural law theorist comes along and says, well, we have our public reasons, they're natural law. And it turns out, though, that many people remain unconvinced by natural law arguments, especially on culture war issues, and they get disappointed. I call the figures that they get disappointed frustrated fellow travelers. They are individuals who, let's say, agree with conservatives on a lot of moral issues and find that the natural law arguments are not entirely persuasive to people that hold other views. But I think within the natural law tradition itself, especially articulated by Aquinas, there's a reason why, in fact, people do wind up disagreeing on moral questions, even if they wind up at the end of the day still embracing similar moral principles. And Aquinas points out that we are not only rational creatures, we're not only rational beings, we're rational animals. And so there is also an aspect of our nature that involves passion. And so we find as human beings all sorts of ways to justify or attempt to rationalize our indiscretions, and at the same time thinking that we are abiding by a moral law. So, for example, in the debate about abortion, it's pretty clear that there are those on the other side of the debate, those that oppose the pro-life position, who in fact think that they say they agree with us that it is wrong to kill innocent persons without justification. But what they say is that the fetus is not a person. And they give all these sort of elaborate philosophical arguments in order to justify it. This is the phenomenon that Lewis talks about in the first 5 chapters of Mere Christianity that Justin mentioned in his talk, that we have this sort of interesting problem as human beings. We sort of recognize that there is a right way to conduct ourselves and to live our lives, but at the same time we recognize that a lot of us don't live up to it, including ourselves. And the natural law tradition that Henry is talking about is one that actually tries to provide an account for why we, in fact, get it wrong sometimes. The other thing that Henry, I think, ignores is the role that that the natural law is not something that's independent of either divine law or eternal law. That is, for Aquinas, the natural law is a kind of a conclusion that human beings draw from the fact that we understand our own good, and we develop over time, or we begin to understand certain moral precepts as a consequence of reflecting on the ends, the good ends to which we're ordered. And for that reason, we understand ourselves as not simply embracing the natural law because it is something simply separated or divorced from divine power. It's something that God, in fact, has imparted to us. In addition to that, Aquinas points out, and the church affirms, that we as human beings are ordered towards the beatific vision, which means that the whole counsel of God is not something arrived at by the natural law. We need something called the divine law or sacred scripture. And so one of the fears, I think, that folks like Henry have is that somehow we can sort of learn everything about God and morality simply from our own reason. And if anything, if I think a careful reading of at least the parts of the Summa dealing with the natural law is that, in fact, Aquinas says just quite the opposite, that, in fact, his claims about the natural law are actually quite modest. So those are pretty much, I mean, I can go on and talk about other things as well, but I'd like to give Paul a chance to say a few things. But I do think that much of the misunderstanding, I think, arises from, I think, just not a careful reading of what folks like Aquinas teach. And one other thing, and I think this will tie a little bit into the history comments that Jordan made, that I think that much of what is contemporary, at least evangelicalism, comes out of an era in which there was, quote unquote, the battle for the Bible. And so there's this real protectiveness, understanding of protecting scripture from incursions of modernism or incursions of sort of reason outside of scripture. And so I think a lot of the way in which Henry and others read, at least modern evangelicalism, it's an attempt to sort of protect scripture, and that the idea that we can know things about God, including the moral law, apart from scripture, is a kind of modernist challenge to that understanding. I think they're wrong about that, but I can see why, at least, you know, with the reformers and Protestant scholasticism, that really wasn't even on the radar. And I think with contemporary evangelicalism, it is. I can't hear you, Hadley. You got to unmute yourself.
Let me follow on that one quickly, because Frank touches a part of Henry that I couldn't believe he had, that a natural law depends on things being seen in every place and shared and perceived in the same way. Remember Aquinas saying, it's a necessary truth that a triangle has 180 degrees, but it's not the truth that will be evident to every self happening down the street. And what you get here, again, it couldn't be a surprise to him. It's the nature of people to disagree about significant things. But of course, as you and I have been through this, when we get this line from people saying, if there were these moral truths that hold in all places, they'd be recognized in all places. The very fact that they inspire such wide disagreement must be prima facie evidence that there are no such truths. And of course, what the philosophers say in response to that is, well, I disagree with that proposition. And by its own terms, that should be enough to bring it down. You know, in my own course of first things, I would say this course has a codicil that everything here could be wrong. But just to say that implies there are right and wrong answers, and reason will be the currency in which we're dealing with it. So, okay, let me pass it up. Paul, let me help bring it in. Thanks for that. That was very clear. Yeah, Paul?
To pick up on Hadley's point, it's in fact, when we talk about moral disagreement, there is moral disagreement, and his argument for the incoherence of relativism from disagreement about disagreement is absolutely brilliant. In the midst of the disagreement, there's also across cultures a number of things that obtain. For instance, the prohibition on incest. And it's not just C.S. Lewis's work at the back in the Appendix to Abolition of Man or in the essay on ethics, but we find with Cooper's work in Primitive Man, Bice's work in Anthropology, and others. And I've done a little bit of work on this as well, looking at Xenophon and early Greeks. There's a surprising amount of agreement. Socrates and Hippias have this discussion in Xenophon's Memorabilia about the common unwritten laws and what could be the cause of them that obtain for all peoples, even though they haven't met together and discussed. Justin began with a story, so let me tell you a story. I'm an undergraduate in 1995, not now, but in the 90s. In the 95, I'm an undergraduate at the time, and as it happens, I am arguing with a protege of Alplantiga's, and I'm arguing a line from Martin Luther's Bondage of the Will, the voluntarist line that God's will is determinative of good and evil, right and wrong, righteous and unrighteous. There's no cause of it. Luther says it's uncaused. And Plantinga's protege, one of his proteges, Carlton Fisher, looks at me and says, well, yes, that's well and good, but what do you do with God's goodness then? On account of what is God good? And the position unraveled for me quickly. And I came to realize at that point, of course, I had always held that God was good, but that this identification of God and goodness has to be foundational to ethical thinking. And it is, I would like to argue, in the mainstream natural law tradition, such that Scotus on the one hand, William of Ockham on the other, are departures from a tradition that is not only in Aquinas, but in the patristics. Now, it is this case, I think Jordan was certainly right, that there are multiple, really two traditions of natural law, or ways of thinking, as Frank Oakley pointed out in a famous article, Two Natural Laws, in the Middle Ages. One has sometimes called the intellectualist or the realist tradition, and the other is called the voluntarist tradition. And the realist tradition is often aligned with traces to Thomas Aquinas, that things are obligatory because good. And the voluntarist tradition of natural law then linked to William of Ockham, that something is good if and only if, because and only because commanded by God. But Ockham also held that what is commanded by God is right as apprehended by right reason, and that there are some things that always hold for us in the world as ordered. There's this distinction in the Middle Ages between the absolute and ordained powers of God. And Aquinas and his teacher Albert use it before Ockham gets a hold of it. The absolute power of God means simply, as Frank Oakley and Courtenay have argued, the worlds that God could create. Not that he deliberates about these things, but the worlds that he could create, right? And the ordained power of God has to do with the world that he in fact creates, that he in fact actualizes. And for Albert Manus, as for Aquinas, there were multiple worlds, but they were delimited by God's wisdom and goodness. God could not metaphysically actualize a world that was contrary to wisdom and his wisdom and goodness. What happens with Ockham is that he radicalizes the absolute power of God, so that God in his absolute power could actualize any world in which he exists and the law of non-contradiction holds. But anything else that we call good could be other than it was. Murder could be good if God commanded us to murder. Not just killing, but murder could be good if God commanded us to murder. Lying could be good, but God's in fact commanded the opposite. But he could have commanded differently than he did. And we have then these two accounts of not just a divine command account and natural law account, two accounts of natural law that move forward. One comes to be called, as we get to the late Middle Ages, the Via Antiqua, the ancient way, and the other, the Via Moderna, the modern way. And you could, on the Occamist account, more or less say, well, we have a world ordained by God, created by God, with moral apprehension, just as we have it in the Thomistic scheme, but way back, it's ultimately a function of divine, sheer, omnipotent will that could have commanded it be other than it was, but in fact has commanded it to be this particular way. I want to suggest that there's a deep problem with this view, nevertheless. I won't lay out the argument, but this view that we might call voluntarism, we see in Occam, that we see in Samuel Pufendorf, an heir of Luther. Arguably, he hated Melanchthon. That's what Melanchthon had done in moral thought. But in many modern theorists, there's voluntarism at the back of it. Voluntarism is ultimately self-referentially incoherent. It not only eviscerates divine goodness or divine justice, but it is also an incoherent view. In fact, Aquinas famously says in De Veritate, to say that justice depends simply on the will is to say that the divine will does not proceed according to the order of wisdom. And that is blasphemous. I think Aquinas is right. And it's then fortuitous that with Hooker, especially within Protestant precincts, you have a return to realist natural law. But I would like to argue that the realist tradition is normative, not only because it's the only coherent tradition of the two, but if we go back to the patristics, realism isn't in question. The objectivity, the reality, the transcendent goodness to which we are ordered, that's not in question. It comes in question later in the Middle Ages, post-Aquinas, and then there's a voluntarist natural law tradition going forward, but the realist tradition is normative, and I'd like to suggest also that it's the coherent between the two. The voluntarist natural law tradition doesn't actually stand up logically, but I think we have to at some point get to the discussion, or in these discussions get to what's at the foundation. What is it? Ultimately, is it divine goodness or divine will to power beyond good and evil?
What is your own judgment?
It's divine goodness, because among other things, it's impossible to distinguish among instances of will on the basis of will. And by the time you trace that out, any account of ethics that is grounded ultimately in will collapses into self-referential.
It's a non-moral stance. Now you remind me of Lincoln's second inaugural.
Well, that's fantastic. I'll take it.
Yeah, when he says both sides of this conflict pray to the same God. And then he says, well, if you can believe that a just God would approve drawing your own living from the sweat of other men's faces, well, the judgments of God are righteous altogether. Let us not judge. But no, Lincoln was raising the question, do you think God really would be on both sides of this? That God could not understand the contradiction? It would not take a position. Yeah. Before we break, I want to get the reaction of our friends around the table to this one other problem. This other that's intrigued me. My late Professor Leo Strauss used to say there was no nature in the Bible and no appeal to philosophy. And then we'd say, well, wait a minute, the notion of a covenant does imply a certain kind of creature. There's only one kind of creature who can reckon a commitment, give a commitment, keep his commitment, even when it runs counter to his interests or inclinations. You must have in mind the being who is part of this scheme. And on the other hand, if people say that we can understand these moral truths only through revelation, then I wonder, what do they do with, now I get the sense of my friends, what do they do with Abraham negotiating with God over Sodom and Gomorrah? Is he telling God that he hasn't seen the full implications of his own revelation? What he's doing? Or is he holding up another standard? Shall the God of all not be just? Is he not appealing to some independent standard apart from the will of God? Yeah, Frank, you're going to jump in.
Yeah, you know what? I mean, even if you go to the something as simple as the Ten Commandments, honor thy father and mother, right? I mean, it presupposes that people know what fathers and mothers are, right? It presupposes what it means to honor, right? Jesus, when he was preaching and he said, you wouldn't give your son a loaf of a rock and claim it was a loaf of bread, right? I mean, it assumes what a kind of natural responsibility that human beings have to their offspring, right? So the Good story of the Good Samaritan, the question was, who is my neighbor, right? And Jesus tells the story. And there was a sense that his audience would recognize it immediately, right? In addition to that, I mean, your former professor Leo Strauss's comment about natures aren't in the Bible. I mean, the whole development of theology, while the church itself is deciding the canon, are debates about natures, right? I mean, the Council of Nicaea, right? For those of us who go to churches that recite the Nicene Creed, we say that the Son is one and is of the same substance as the Father. Even little old ladies say that, and they don't know it, right? Unless they're theologians, right? So there's a sense in which the idea that you can sort of separate Scripture from the bodies in which Scripture arose, which engaged in philosophical discussion, I think is artificial. I don't think that's the right way to look at it. So
take it just one step further, Frank, and then we'll just join our other friends. Honor thy mother and thy father. That could not be referring simply to the biological father, or else we'd be obliged to honor the man who sired us in the course of a rape. So he said it must be referring to the mother and father who fulfilled the moral definition of parenting, those who were there to nurture and to protect. And so we raise this because so many friends say, well, just follow the directions of the Ten Commandments. We said, no, you may need to take them to another level, the level of natural law, to understand not all killings are murders. We have to talk about the unjustified killing. It's not always wrong to bill for their false witness, say to the Nazis at the door looking at for the Jews you're hiding. So in all these things, when we say even these imperatives must depend on some underlying reasoning about the ends that would be rightful and wrongful, justified or unjustified, we can't get away from the natural law there. But anyway, let's just throw it open. Anyone else has something to say?
Sure. So there's some fantastic questions in the queue, and I'd like to take the liberty of combining two of them. Hadley, you'll know Alan Hurst from our James Wilson Fellows alumni.
Wonderful.
Alan's question is, Alan shares your instincts about voluntarism's incoherence and effective denial of the goodness of God. He asks, could you say a few words about why some very smart people find voluntarism nonetheless attractive and persuasive? Why has this idea survived so long when not a single teacher Alan's ever had has ever said a good word about Occam for coming up with it? And there was a related question from Alex Hempstead, who asks, based on Paul DeHart's comments, he seems to be leading to the conclusion that God is bound by wisdom. Am I understanding this correctly? So Paul, I feel like both of those questions were inspired by your comments, but then surely other folks around the round table should chime in.
So let me take, and I think C.S. Lewis captures, has for me since the 90s, the normative Christian position here is that God is goodness, God is wisdom. So we're not positing some sort of thing above God, right? But God's will in particular, when God acts through, this is the effect of wisdom and goodness. So it's not as if there's some will that God has that's over goodness, and that goodness is some sort of creation of God. So, if you will, I'm not saying anything different than Hooker when Hooker says God's nature is as a law to his doing. What I'm suggesting is God has, God is goodness. God is goodness. God is wisdom itself. As for why Occam has some traction, I think that Occam per se is deeply problematic. But in the history of thought, you find various arguments that are will-based about that. Think of the Athenians in the Melian dialogue, and they're setting up strength and power is the basis of their action. So the will-based way of thinking you find in Thomas Hobbes. But I will say also this. Although I am leery of the danger of making sovereignty a God over God, I think that some tend that direction. I think it's the wrong way to go. I think also that God's authority matters, right? And it's possible to think about the ontology of ethics, the way that obligation is put together in a way that God's will is somehow irrelevant or doesn't matter. And that would be a wrong way to go about thinking of this too. It seems that we need the lawgiver. It's just that for Occam, the law is a sheer command, right? It's sheer will, and that's not a good way to think about it. But we do need to be able to think about the lawgiver and divine freedom. And so it's just that I think with Occam and some who follow him, that instinct gets carried, the pendulum swings to an extreme there.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else on the roundtable want to jump in? Justin?
Yeah, I can jump in. I don't know that I'll hit that question exactly right, but I had some thoughts from the comments that were made. And thinking about this in the context of the founders, Paul's done some really good work on uncovering the moral philosophy classes, the curriculum of the moral philosophy classes of the founding era. And most of the moral philosophy classes had in their curriculum exactly these kinds of questions. And so they were aware of them and they addressed them, and they were foundational kinds of questions. And I think that's what my thought was tending toward, was how these things are foundational. So often you get the rejoinder that, well, look, people disagree about some of these moral questions, or this is not a panacea. It doesn't solve all our problems. It doesn't give us the right answer to every case. But that's not really the point. I think the point is that these foundational questions are really important questions, and they can tend in different directions depending on how you answer them. And so what we've been going through, and what other people have tried to make the case for, is that really there's this choice between whether things are really good in their essence, or whether it's simply nominal, and whether reason and goodness are united with respect to authority. And these theological questions then track onto political questions and jurisprudential questions. And this was all in the founding. As I was thinking about this, there's a section from Wilson's lectures where he gets into this foundational question. And the question is, what's the source of moral obligation? Why should I obey the law of nature? And so he's getting into this, and he starts talking about axiomatic truths that we just know intuitively. And he shares in this, I think, some continuities here with what goes before. Thomas Aquinas said that the first precept of natural law is that good is to be done and pursued and evils to be avoided. Calvin says something similar. He said that the foundational moral axiom is that one action is good and worthy of being followed. And Wilson gets into this kind of inquiry, and he says that the science of morals, as well as other sciences, is founded on truths that cannot be discovered or proved by reasoning. But then he says that for a man ignorant of the categories of right and wrong, the terms would be to him equally unintelligible as the term colored to one who is born and has continued blind. And so he gets into this, that there are some foundational moral axioms, including the distinction between right and wrong and the reality of that moral distinction between right and wrong. And we have to start with that intuitive truth, as he calls it, that some actions are right and wrong before the enterprise of moral reasoning gets off the ground. And then the task of moral reasoning, at least according to Wilson, is a task that's informed by the natural law and by the law revealed in the Bible, as he says, by our conscience, our reason, and by the Holy Scriptures. And according to Wilson, revelation would refine and exalt, but it wouldn't contradict the moral knowledge that we know and discover through reason. And so he says, Scripture presupposes, and this is Wilson, he says, it presupposes a knowledge of the principles of morality, and it's addressed to rational and moral agents capable of previously knowing the rights of man and the tendencies of actions, of approving what is good and disapproving what is evil. And so all of these big questions and these debates are really foundational to the whole enterprise. And what we're left with as an alternative is power. And that's what Paul got into. He ended with this question of whether it's simply the will to power beyond good and evil. And that's a theological question for God's nature, but it's also a question that maps onto our own politics and our own jurisprudence.
Right, absolutely.
And that's where I think the real rub is, and that's where the real payoff is in terms of getting these questions right. Because if you don't, you end up with power for its own sake at some point.
Hadley, can I say something in response to Paul? But I think I'm going to be able to do it in a way that gets back.
Just jump in.
Yeah, some of the concerns about how we got here. So one way of understanding what Paul has articulated, I think, so itself cogently and passionately, is a kind of a decline narrative. And Protestants in the Reformation period had their own decline narratives of how we got here. And interestingly, there are different points of departure for when things started to go wrong with the early medieval church to the high medieval church to the late medieval period. But there's a consistent kind of typology that the Reformed have that distinguish between the sounder scholastics and the later, more problematic and corrupted form of scholastic theology. And consistently, Thomas is counted among the sounder scholastics. So it's not the case that the Protestants or the Reformed are simply trying to recapitulate simply what Thomas says, but they find in him a great deal more positive points of departure for their own theologizing, and he's consistently counted among the sounder scholastics. So how did we get from that position in the 16th century to somebody like Carl Henry working with basically a caricature of Thomas Aquinas? Well, there's a lot that happens, obviously, in the meantime. Some stuff's going on in the 18th century with respect to philosophy and its relationship to theology, the importation of new philosophical methods, the collapse of a kind of Christian Aristotelianism, which was pan-confessional among Protestants and Catholics. But I want to say a little bit more about actually the 19th century, because I think this gets at both some of the motivations and the historical causes for some of the more recent decline narratives, right, which are laying blame about a kind of Protestant voluntarism versus a Catholic realism, right? That's the basic kind of typology you get in a lot of 20th century historiography and polemic. I think by the time we get to the 19th century, Protestant traditions have obviously established and grown and become localized in many ways. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Dutch context, the Dutch Reform context, but especially with respect to the rise of Neo-Thomism and the celebration of Thomas in 1871 in Aeterni Patris, Thomas becomes, for the Roman Catholic identity, really important. Of course, he was always important. Now he's lifted up even more as kind of the symbol par excellence of Christian philosophy and celebrated. Well, we've changed in the sense on the Protestant side from the 16th century, counting Thomas among the sounder scholastics and looking to him among other lesser authorities, always properly ordered under Scripture, to a sense of Protestant identity being less about Catholicity and the necessary reforms that needed to be taken place as being Protestant and defining yourself over against Roman Catholicism. So just as the Roman Catholic Church is, in a sense, rediscovering or reinvigorating its appropriation understanding of Thomas in the 19th century, increasingly Protestants are happy to say, yes, absolutely, actually, you can have him. We don't want Thomas because he's rationalizing and all this kind of stuff. So this is going on in the background. And I think that is an important background for what we get in the 20th century, where you get critics from the Reformed tradition, Dutch Neo-Calvinist tradition, who are less concerned about identifying the Christian church understood in terms of its Catholicity than they are with basically a more sectarian kind of identification. I'm going to stop there, but I do think that there's a lot more to tease out in terms of the historiography from figures like Lortz and Service Pinkers and Richard Weaver even, and Alistair McIntyre up to Brad Gregory more recently, about how a particular version of understanding morality got associated with one confession, that is the Protestant varieties of confessions, as opposed to, say, the Roman Catholic tradition.
Can I just, I'd like to associate myself, I think, with the restorationist narrative, a little bit like Bob Riley does, in terms of the American founding involving a restoration of objective and real goodness that we see in Hooker. But even as I think about moral reflection today, I don't agree with Bob Adams about everything. He's not inclined towards natural law on the one hand, but he's doing things with real and transcendent goodness. And then Rob Coons, who was Bob's student, is a natural law thinker. And I think that you can sort of see the rise of realism. I'd like to say I sort of affirm the return of the perennial philosophy, and maybe discussions like this get at a certain breadth to its return.
So Hadley, do you want to get a quick comment in before we move to the next topic?
No, let's get the other questions.
Great. So we have another one of our James Wilson Fellows from the same year, actually 2015, Josh Turner. And Josh writes, is there a meaningful distinction between the Reformed tradition and the medievals in how, quote, far and how much, quote, clarity general revelation can carry human reason? And if so, is it possible that some questions are of sufficient particularity that to answer them rightly may require reference to divine revelation? Not directed to any one of you, so feel free to.
This is going to be Jordan's wheelhouse, but I'm going to put one thing on the table, and Jordan, you can clarify and extend this. I don't know if this is a helpful way to think about it, but within Reformed theology and some of the Reformed theologians, you got a distinction between our knowledge of God the Creator and our knowledge of God the Redeemer. And we could have natural knowledge of God the Creator, and then natural knowledge of God the Creator could tell us certain things about life. And that might imply certain things about, say, the mechanical sciences or the liberal arts, or how to live together in a political community. And that's just going to be different and separate from the kind of knowledge that we would need to have about God's plan for redemption. And that's the kind of thing that we are not going to come up with on our own through the exercise of reason. So that might be a helpful way to think about it, although there's plenty more to say. Jordan, you can jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very helpful, Justin. And it goes back to that introductory kind of framing that you get from the Belgian Confession, for example, talking about the two books, and especially an understanding of special revelation as helping to clarify, correct our misunderstandings of what's available to us through the book of nature. Let me just say, I think, and this is speaking too broadly, but I do think there may be a distinction among the Reformed as opposed to, say, most medieval scholastics and traditions in their understanding of virtue. And this goes back to what Justin was just talking about. So there's a kind of a caricature of the Reformed tradition that there's no place for any goodness of any sort in the human person, qua fallen human person. It's actually the case that they're very careful to talk about categorical differences between, say, soteriological issues having to do with human salvation and merit relating to salvation, as opposed to other categories of human existence, like living together in a polity or something like this. So there's a kind of a traditional distinction between good of various kinds in the Reformed tradition and the Protestant traditions. Saving good is the meritorious good, is the kind of good that only Jesus Christ has accomplished through his active and passive obedience, for example, and merited graciously on behalf of us. There's a kind of a level of Christian good that's only achievable by someone who's working internally out of a regenerated true faith, and it's done in accordance with God's law. But there is also yet another kind of good that the Reformed tradition affirms. It's called civic righteousness or civic good, which has to do more with the kind of traditional virtues we would associate with civic virtues like justice and right and honesty and these sorts of things. And so they're limited goods in the sense that they're non-saving. They're made possible because of God's preserving grace and his ongoing maintenance and governing of the world in a moral sense, and allowing, even if in a corrupted and flawed way, human conscience to continue to exist, and so on. I think there, in generally speaking, is a little bit more optimism arising out of many of the medievals about the role of virtue, a human virtue in the salvation process, although there's a great diversity among Protestants with respect to that. So that would be one key point of departure, I'd say, is not that it's Catholics affirm virtue and Protestants, don't, but it's where are the limits to what humans can accomplish, and in what sense can we call a human action good in any sense, and how do we disambiguate that?
I'd like to follow
go
up
ahead,
on
Frank.
what Jordan said. I think one of the I think the original question also dealt with natural theology, if I'm not mistaken. Is that it was Josh Turner, right, that raised it?
Yes.
Yeah. So oftentimes I think the reformers and at least Aquinas are very close on this. One of the things that Aquinas is concerned about in terms of natural theology is that he doesn't really think it has the sort of soteriological power that, let's say, contemporary Christian apologists put on it, right? So Aquinas actually says in a place that what we believe about God through natural reason is what is one of the preambles of faith, but that is not what we affirm by faith in terms of the articles of faith. And that parallels very close to the distinction that Justin mentioned earlier, and I forget the exact terms he used. And one reason for this, and Aquinas he points this out in the Summa, that if we think that we need to have natural theology in order for our wills to be moved by faith, we are going to fall to the Pelagian heresy. That is, it means that somehow our reason plays a necessary role in the movement of our will to God, apart from grace. And so that's interesting where if you read Aquinas, I think he comes very close to sounding like the way many Reformed thinkers sound when dealing with this sort of falling into this Pelagian heresy.
We had another question. This one came in anonymously, but we wanted to use it as another jumping off point. Couldn't it be that the modern Reformed theologians are rejecting the natural law tradition because they believe that it's inconsistent with the Reformed doctrine of the bondage of the will? For doesn't natural law theory leave a bright spot or unfallen aspect of human nature in the intellect, which could have an analog in the human will? And if so, doesn't that leave open the way for a libertarian conception of free will that may be inconsistent with the Reformed doctrine of the bondage of the will?
If the question is that the motivation of some, or could it be? Certainly, definitely. That's certainly not the way that the Reformed themselves in the 16th century framed the questions of free choice. They affirmed what they believed was an orthodox Reformed version of the understanding of free choice and natural law at the same time. So what you have in that sense is a kind of intra-traditional dispute about whether or not figures like Calvin and Vermigli and others understood the implications of some of their own foundational doctrines and were actually themselves incoherent. Because it seems to me that would have to basically be the claim, historically speaking, at least, for such a 20th century position.
To have a fall, you have to have something that falls, right? You have to have something that's corrupted. And insofar as we're talking about the thing itself, as Augustine said, there must be some good there. Evil is not a thing itself. So if all we have is the fall, we'd have pure evil, but we'd have nothing. We'd have nothing at all. And it's so to affirm the existence of anything is to affirm that there is some genuine, real good there. And I've just been reading Yaroslav Pelikan's masterful volume on the Cappadocians, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus, Basil Caesarea. Again, it's been a while since I looked at it. And Gregory of Nyssa is essentially saying God would have been a bungler if, having created us and knowing we'd fall, he'd left no light at all. Right? No illumination. Yes, our illumination is darkened. It doesn't mean it's not there. Our will is bent. We're fallen, but that doesn't mean that the good of creation is deleted by the fall or erased by the fall. That which is a defective good is still a good. It's still a real good. And so I think there's a temptation to make the fall primary. But the late Thomas Oden used to say, we ought to remember that creation and redemption are both more fundamental than the fall. The fall is serious, it's important, but we ought not make the fall bigger than creation itself.
I want to sign on to that one. Very good. If we weren't pressed for time, I'd say these are rather deep running questions, and I'm wondering whether Alan or Josh might want to jump in to just follow up and give us those. Do we have time for any of that?
So we have a few more questions. I think
Josh we have time for it? I thought we
have time for a few more.
Okay, save 30 seconds for me, yeah. Okay.
Sure. So our next question comes in actually over email from Mike Cantrell. And Mike asks, how do you square a realist notion of God's goodness with Scripture's description of God exercising sovereign providence over disasters, such as in Job, Amos, and Micah, light and darkness, well-being and calamity, good and bad, life and death? Descriptions like this seem to explode any easy realist notion of goodness that is univocally applicable to both humans and God.
Mike's a former student of mine, so I feel obligated to respond. I think he's right that I think using univocal language about God is inadequate. I think that we need. We talk, for example, about God's goodness, and I don't think that it's right to think of God's goodness in the same way that we think of, let's say, the moral goodness of a human being. We think of our moral goodness. We think of that we are living consistently with certain moral principles that we believe are commanded to us by God in some way. But God doesn't have any moral principles that he has to abide by, in the sense that that there is a moral law above him in any way. Now, of course, I know the typical response to this is that the moral law is within him, but I don't think that's what at least, in the Catholic tradition, we talk about God being good. We simply mean that he's the fullness of being, that he's all perfection. And we only mean it analogically and not univocally. Now I just want to go back to something that Paul mentioned earlier when he was talking about Occam, and this give me a chance to say something about. Paul made the distinction between God's will and God's goodness, but I actually think a better distinction is God's reason and God's will. That is, I think for Occam, Occam's rejecting God's reason as being primary because that limits God for him. And so what's doing the work there for a kind of voluntarist view is Occam's concern that by saying that reason is what is ultimately doing the work, it limits God. So it's his attempt to defend God's omnipotence or power.
Hadley?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
You have another question? Something else from?
Well,
Can I?
I thought you were ready to jump in, but Paul, do you want to get a
No,
quickie in?
no, I'll
Okay.
take a pass. I mean, let's see if there are other questions or other comments from our friends here.
Thinking about that question, it's a challenging question in terms of how we interpret and understand scripture and the challenges that come with that. So I wouldn't think there's any easy answers at all. But I'd note that the premise of the question assumes that the reality of our knowledge of good and evil. And so it assumes the reality of our knowledge of those categories. And then the conundrum, the problem or the puzzle is, how do we understand what God's doing in this circumstance? But the reason why that circumstance seems to be problematic to us is precisely because we assume we have knowledge of right and wrong in that moment. And if we didn't have it, it wouldn't be a problem.
I'd just say equivocity is as bad as univocity, right? So my position doesn't presuppose any more than an analogical relation. And I think that often in the Christian tradition, good and reason are equatable or identifiable. It's certainly the case that Gregory of Nyssa uses good as the primary concept, but also sometimes he'll use reason in the place of good. The same with Nazianzus and the others. But what we want to avoid is saying, you don't want to say that it's easy. Of course, it's not an easy realism for Gregory, right? It's not an easy realism for C.S. Lewis. Those aren't easy realist positions, but they certainly don't want to avoid equivocity. I think we risk descending into heresy at the point of equivocity rather than an analogy.
We have a few other questions which kind of touch on a bunch of different subjects. I wanted to go to Professor Tuamala's question. He asks, can one of the speakers address Cornelius Van Til's critique of traditional Catholic theology, particularly the relationship of nature and grace? Yeah, Justin?
That's you, Jordan.
Yeah, probably. I will preface this all too brief answer with saying that I would not consider myself in any way an expert on Van Til himself. I've read about some of the critiques and so on. Let me just say, I do think there is a difference, there's a disjunction between the early figures in the Neo-Calvinist movement and some of the later figures on this question. So by my reading, Abraham Kuyper and Herman Bavinck as the kind of fountainheads of this Dutch Neo-Calvinist Renaissance in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, affirm natural law within the context of an understanding of common grace, which they understand to be a confessional matter for the Reformed. And in fact, Kuyper and his articulation of common grace goes back to some of these passages in the Canons of Dort that I've just pointed out. Van Til has his own critiques of these themes, both common grace and a moral order, you could say, as an expression of common grace coming out of these earlier figures. Herman Dooyeweerd is another figure who overlaps, but is in some senses a later figure and has important salient critiques of this kind of natural law understanding. I do think that those figures fit into what I would consider that characterization that I articulated earlier. That is, in the sense that Kuyper and Bavinck are more concerned to be rooting their understandings within the broader tradition of the church understood in its Catholicity than Dooyeweerd and Van Til are. And part of that is an understanding of their own account of the relationship between philosophy and theology and its corruption by kind of Aristotelian and Greek importations into the Christian tradition, which they associate with medieval scholasticism, but also later rationalism and so on. And while some of those elements are there in Kuyper and Bavinck, they don't rise to the level of urgency that they do in figures like Van Til to essentially break his view, have a substantive break with his views from that of the Catholicity of natural laws we've been talking about.
Jordan, can I just add maybe too simple a question, but what do they find in the Greeks that would be the source of such diversion. Remember, John Paul II said that if it weren't for Greek philosophy, the church could have fallen into rank superstition.
Well, I think it has to do with, it's a kind of a ground motive or a worldview critique. That is, anything that comes out of the unregenerate is intrinsically man-centered and therefore idolatrous.
That we can't address the force of the reasoning they were offering.
I don't affirm their view. So, I mean,
No,
that's essentially the spirit of the critique yeah, and certainly Van Til with the whole presuppositional apologetic school he's founded, it's like, if you don't have everything, right, including, your views of the Trinity and so on, it's not a propositional account of truth in that sense. It's a whole system that you either have or you don't.
That's the way that's why I treat arguments from Democrats. Yeah, okay.
We have time probably for two more questions. The first is from a dear friend of ours in the James Wilson Senior Seminar, Dick Helmholtz.
Oh, great.
And Dick takes a bigger picture, or at least wants us to take a wider lens to ask, how are we to understand the long history of slavery? We know, for example, that the medieval church allowed it, and that many monasteries, for example, held each other in slavery.
This is where Bob Riley should jump in. About the history of the Catholic writers, Ballor and others who are laying down the opposition to slavery. But I'll defer to somebody else.
I'm not sure exactly how to address the question of the long history of slavery, but I think that is one of those institutions that seems to persist for quite a long time and is universal across history. And one of the things that we might want to account for is not the institution itself, but the demise of the institution and why that comes about. I'm reminded of the Republican Party platform in the 1850s that said they came together to combat the twin relics of barbarism, which was slavery and polygamy, and how the moral premises came together to try to do that exactly, and why those two things seem to be relics from the ancient world. But in terms of the history of Christian theology, I'm not sure I'm the right person to address that in particular in terms of how we've addressed the full history of slavery and the natural law. I would say that on the natural law side, though, I can say just a little bit about that. I think that the natural law premises that are developed over time and that are part of the American founding are decisively against the institution of slavery. And part of the reason why we see its decline in the US and why we have the Civil War and why we have the amendments after the Civil War that we have is precisely because of the underlying natural law premises that people are appealing to. And in the US, you saw in this way a revisiting of Aristotle in the South as a defense of natural slavery. But I think I was convinced of this in my graduate seminar on Aristotle, that Aristotle's teaching on natural slavery is actually quite more nuanced than those in the South would have thought, and that even the premises on Aristotle's own terms were a decisive blow to American slavery in the way it was practiced here.
I think, but that's one of those questions that get us to the very edge of the things we can't account for with a syllogism. You think of Justice McLean's dissent in the Dred Scott case, where he leans in and says, you may think that black man is chattel, but he's a creature made in the impress of his maker. He's amenable to the laws of God and man, and he is destined to an endless existence, which is to say, he has a soul that will not decompose when his material existence comes to an end. And then there's Lincoln, the telling passage in Lincoln where he says, no one made in the graven image was sent into the world to be imbruted, be considered a thing of no account. Now you say, we're not going to get that out of a syllogism. We may have some of the scheme of the Declaration. It presupposes, I think, this argument, but something else needs to supply the understanding that that human being, has something of intrinsic importance. And again, I don't think we get that from a syllogism.
The first argument in principle against slavery is Gregory of Nyssa in some sermons that he delivered, some homilies on Ecclesiastes. And in the course of that, he, in principle, argues against Roman slavery. In fact, he takes Christ saying, what does it profit a man to gain the world and lose his soul? And he says, well, that means that each soul is worth more than the whole cosmos. And what did you pay for a soul worth more than the whole cosmos? Frank's colleague, Rod Stark, in one of his books with Princeton Press, argues that the medieval world virtually stamped out the old Roman slave system, and that chattel slavery and early modern slavery with the exploitation of the African Gold Coast was a reintroduction of something that Christianity had virtually eliminated. The old slave system from Rome had been wiped out, and it's reintroduced over the objection, by the way, of multiple popes. Who said this is not the right way to go. So I think that while it existed in places, certainly the old Roman slavery had been wiped out because of the Christian Revolution, and then we see a movement again away from Christian principles on this.
That's so good. But I wonder, Garrett, Dick Hummels is one of our leading experts on the history of natural law. Is it possible to have Dick come on back again? Can we get an audio of that if Dick would like to? Because he must have his own reflection on the problem.
If he would like, I've unmuted him, but it's...
Well, here I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead, Dick. Go ahead, Dick.
I think what you said was quite good. It amounts, I think, to saying that slavery was always suspect after the Christian revelation, but they didn't have the courage to eliminate it, at least not at once. It was sort of a gradual elimination. Whether that will stand up, I'm not sure, but I didn't know about Gregory of Nyssa, and I thought that was quite interesting to hear.
Thanks so much for that, Dick. Thanks for sitting in with us on.
It's been pretty interesting.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, our last question is going to go to Professor Roberta Bayer, a friend, who has delegated the question asking to me. She asks, is it not the case that for James Wilson, it was impossible to have a Republican government without a real knowledge of the natural law? Does not democracy depend on a particular philosophy, as he put it?
Well, you're preaching to the choir there. Yes, I think that is an accurate assessment of James Wilson, and I think that was why it was so important to him to start with that. He's giving lectures to students on law, but he's not trying to necessarily train them to be attorneys. He's trying to get them to think in much deeper ways about the structure of our regime and what kind of education would be required to uphold it, and what kinds of questions people need to think about. So I think you're right about that, and he thought that that was essential to a Republican government, to be able to get those kinds of questions right. And I think for the reason that Paul had suggested earlier, and we'd already talked about, because without that fundamental underlying foundation or premise, then things just do descend into the will to power. And I think we see that in all sorts of ways in our society today, but there are consequences for ideas, and ideas tend to manifest themselves in the real world in predictable ways.
Well, there was that Lincoln's Cooper Union speech where he referred to those black slaves who had the wit not to throw in with John Brown. He said, even though they were unlettered, they were illiterate, they could see that the schemes of this crazy white man were not going to conduce to their well-being. And which is the pitch is, they may not be literate, but these people are moral agents. They have the capacity to reflect about their rightful or wrongful ends and about the governance of their lives. And they shouldn't simply be made an annex to the purposes of other men without their consent. So I think it's just woven in to the founding, Justin, wouldn't you say?
I think it's woven into the founding, and it's part of the natural law tradition. That question reminded me of a line that C.S. Lewis had in his essay on subjectivism. But he says, subjectivism about values is eternally incompatible with democracy. That as long as we don't think that our rulers are subject to the same law that we are subject, then we cannot have a democracy. And so I think that was an important point that he drew out. And it's a theoretical point, but it has all sorts of practical implications.
Boy, good. I'd like to get the bibliography today too, from Jordan and Paul. I know a lot of Paul's writings. So where are we, Garrett? Are we near the end?
Yeah, well,
Question?
we've come to an end, and the comment of the day, I think, arrives from Steve Hayward, who professor at Cal Berkeley, a natural law scholar himself, and he wanted to convey to this group that this was the finest collection of natural lawyers assembled since Thomas Aquinas dined alone. So
this was the old.
This has been a real treat. Do know that on behalf of First Liberty Institute and the James Wilson Institute, we're just extraordinarily grateful to Jordan, Frank, Justin, Paul, for your time and for your illuminating presentations and discussions. I'm going to turn it over to Hadley for some.
I'll just thank you.
Thoughts before we go.
Just one final thought that as people try to adjudicate the difference in reason and revelation, and they're uneasy about falling back on reason and the laws of reason, we have to ask, well, where do those come from? There was that interesting line of Ronald Knox who said, it's curious that and fitting, that we call scientific laws after the person who discovered them. So I'll talk about Boyle's law. Then he says, it took a considerable mind to discover that law. It took a considerable mind to have put it there in the first place. Okay. So again, I think I just want to thank everybody who's done this. I hope we'll stay together and do another version of this again. But thanks so much. Garrett, you want to take us off?
Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day. And as Professor Arkes said, do keep in touch to all of our attendees. We'll follow up with a recording of this discussion that you can save for your own posterity, but we would encourage you to share it as well. So as to let your friends know that our organization and First Liberty Institute are putting on great programs such as this one. Thank you all.